Vietnam in 1965 was a country split in two. The North had one government, the South had another, and both believed they were fighting for the future of their nation. That year, American combat troops arrived in large numbers, and what had been a distant conflict for most Vietnamese was about to become impossible to ignore. The war was coming to every corner of the country. This is what happened during those years, not just on the battlefield, but in villages, in homes, and in the lives of people trying to survive. Most Vietnamese families lived simple lives in rural villages. They planted rice, harvested crops, and followed the rhythms of farming seasons that their parents and grandparents had known. Kids walked to school along dirt paths. Markets buzzed with vendors selling vegetables, fish, and cloth. Families gathered at temples and churches for ceremonies. Life moved slowly, predictably. But the conflict was spreading. Small battles were happening in remote areas where government troops clashed with guerrilla fighters. Most people in the cities and safer villages hoped it would stay far away. Then, American soldiers started arriving by the thousands. Bases went up near towns. Helicopters filled the skies. The war that felt distant suddenly wasn't distant anymore. It was right there, changing everything. American troops expected to fight a war they understood. Instead, they found themselves in dense jungles, facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The first major battle happened in the Ia Drang Valley, where for days American and North Vietnamese soldiers fought in brutal conditions. Helicopters brought troops in and carried wounded soldiers out. The jungle was thick, hot, and unforgiving. But the Viet Cong had a different way of fighting. They built massive tunnel systems underground, places like Cu Chai where fighters could hide, store supplies, and suddenly appear to attack before vanishing again. For American patrols, every step was dangerous. Trails had hidden traps, rice paddies concealed mines. A quiet village could explode into gunfire without warning. Soldiers couldn't tell who was fighting against them and who was just trying to live. The war grew fast, with more troops arriving, more battles happening, and more casualties mounting. And there were no clear front lines. The fighting could happen anywhere. While battles raged, millions of people had to leave their homes. Sometimes they had a few hours warning. Sometimes they just heard explosions getting closer and knew it was time to go. They grabbed whatever they could carry, rice, clothes, photos, anything small and important. Then they walked, joining rivers of other families heading toward cities or camps where they hoped they'd be safer. The camps that formed were crowded and chaotic. Families lived in makeshift shelters where water was scarce and food was rationed. Disease spread easily. Aid organizations did what they could, but there were just too many people in need. But people tried to keep going. Mothers set up small cooking areas. Fathers looked for any work they could find. Kids made friends with other children in the camp and played games between the shelters. In villages that weren't evacuated, families adapted by digging shelters under their homes. They learned to recognize the sound of different planes and knew when to hide. Farming continued because it had to. People needed to eat, but fields became dangerous places. Unexploded bombs lay hidden in the dirt. Chemicals sprayed from planes killed crops and contaminated water. Simple work like planting rice became a risk. The jungle itself was its own kind of enemy. It was hot, humid, and filled with things that could kill you. Disease-carrying mosquitoes, venomous snakes, infections that wouldn't heal. American forces tried to clear the jungle with chemicals. Planes sprayed Agent Orange to remove the thick canopy where enemy fighters hid, and entire forests turned brown and died. But those chemicals didn't just kill plants. They poisoned the land where families farmed and contaminated rivers where people fished, and years later, children would be born with severe health problems because their parents had been exposed. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters knew the jungle intimately since they'd grown up in these landscapes. They could move silently through terrain that trapped and exhausted foreign soldiers. They built hidden paths and supply routes that seemed impossible to find. For civilians near the fighting, the jungle became both a threat and a refuge. When military operations swept through, families would hide in the forest. But the same dangers that soldiers faced, the disease, the hidden mines, threatened civilians too. American soldiers counted down days until their tour ended. 1 year in Vietnam, if they made it that long. They wrote letters home that took weeks to arrive, talking about families, girlfriends, normal life they'd left behind. Out on patrol, they carried everything on their backs: ammunition, water, rations, gear. Some patrols lasted days where they slept in muddy holes, always listening for sounds in the dark. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers didn't have the option to go home after a year. They fought for as long as the war lasted. They lived in camps deep in the jungle or in the tunnel systems where supply lines brought them food and ammunition, but never enough. The stress affected everyone the same way: the constant fear, watching friends die, never feeling safe. Soldiers on both sides came out of the war changed by what they'd seen and done. For civilians, soldiers were complicated presences. Some villages had sons who joined the Viet Cong, while other villages had American bases nearby. People got caught between sides, never sure who to trust, always trying to protect their families. With men away, fighting or missing, women ran everything. They worked the fields, raised the children, made the decisions, and found ways to earn money or trade for what their families needed. Kids stopped being kids in the usual way. They helped plant and harvest, carried messages between family members separated by the war, and watched their younger siblings while their mothers worked. Schools closed in most areas. Some communities set up classes wherever they could, in a temple, under a tree, in someone's home, where teachers taught without books or supplies, trying to give children something normal to hold on to. Medical care happened in hidden clinics where nurses and doctors worked with almost nothing. Bandages were reused, medicine was scarce. People relied on traditional remedies and luck. The tunnel systems that fighters used also sheltered families during bombings. Some tunnels had spaces where people could sleep, store food, and hide until the danger passed. Even when communication was nearly impossible, people found ways. Messages traveled through networks of family and friends. Radios brought news, though you had to figure out what was true and what was propaganda. Through it all, communities kept their traditions alive. Ceremonies happened in secret. Families celebrated when they could. These moments reminded people of who they were before the war. Then came January 1968, and the war hit a new level. The Tet Offensive surprised everyone, with attacks happening simultaneously across the country, cities, bases, even the American embassy in Saigon. The fighting in Hue lasted a month. Buildings that had stood for centuries were destroyed. Civilians trapped in the city hid in their homes while battles raged in the streets. The offensive failed militarily, but it shattered the idea that the war was winding down and showed that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime. For civilians, Tet meant that even the big cities weren't safe anymore. The fighting had reached everywhere. Thousands died in the crossfire, and survivors emerged to find their neighborhoods destroyed. Around the same time, Khe Sanh was under siege. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the American base, and for months, planes dropped supplies while bombs fell constantly. Every major battle left destruction behind. Roads were cratered, bridges were blown up, water systems stopped working, power lines came down. And rebuilding would have to wait until the fighting moved on, if it ever did. An entire generation of kids knew nothing but war. They couldn't remember a time when the sound of helicopters overhead wasn't normal. They grew up learning which sounds meant danger and where to hide. School became a memory for most. In safer areas, classes happened sporadically with whatever materials teachers could scrape together, and many children went years without any real education. For teenage boys, the question wasn't if they'd join the fighting, but which side they'd end up on. Some were drafted, some joined willingly. Some had no choice when fighters came to their village. Kids in the refugee camps faced the hardest conditions with overcrowding, poor food, and little health care. But children are resilient. They made up games, looked out for each other, and found small joys even in terrible circumstances. Orphanages filled with children who'd lost parents or gotten separated during evacuations. Some had decent staff and supplies, while others struggled to provide basic food and shelter. But even kids in the worst situations held on to something. Friendships formed. Families stayed connected when they could. These connections became lifelines. When the fighting wasn't right there, life tried to be normal. Markets still opened where people bought and sold what they could. Prices jumped around based on supply and danger, but trade continued. Families cooked meals together. Rice was always the base, with whatever else was available. During bad times, meals got very simple, but the act of eating together mattered. Music still played. Artists kept creating. Writers documented everything they saw, and these cultural pieces gave people outlets for their fear and grief and hope. Religious spaces became refuges where temples and churches offered not just prayer, but community, a place to gather, to talk, to help each other through. Sometimes unexpected kindness appeared, a soldier helping fix a house, a fighter warning a village before an attack. Not common, but it happened. Small reminders that humanity survived even here. Neighbors shared what little they had. Families took in relatives fleeing from dangerous areas. Communities pooled resources, and these small acts of cooperation made survival possible. The war ended in 1975, when North Vietnamese forces took Saigon, and 20 years of fighting finally stopped. The cost was staggering: millions dead on all sides, cities and villages destroyed, farmland poisoned, unexploded bombs buried everywhere, waiting to kill people for decades to come. Millions of Vietnamese left the country as refugees, scattered across the world. American veterans came home to a country that didn't know how to welcome them, and many struggled with trauma that no one understood yet. Children born after the war still showed effects from Agent Orange exposure. Health problems passed through generations. Vietnam slowly rebuilt. It took years, but the country recovered. Relations with America normalized eventually. And today's Vietnam has a generation that only knows the war through stories. But those years shaped everything. The people who lived through it carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Wars don't just end when the fighting stops. They echo through families, through communities, through entire nations. The Vietnam War showed what happens when conflict touches every part of life. And understanding that matters, because war isn't just history. It's millions of individual human stories. Stories of people who woke up every day trying to survive, trying to protect their families, trying to hold on to pieces of normal life even when everything around them was chaos. These weren't just soldiers or civilians or casualties. They were farmers and teachers, mothers and children, people who had dreams and plans before the war came. And when it finally ended, they had to figure out how to live with what they'd experienced, how to rebuild not just their country, but themselves. That's what war really is. Not the dates and battles we read about, but the lived experience of millions of people whose lives were forever changed. And those stories deserve to be remembered, not just as history, but as a reminder of what's truly at stake when nations go to war.